And we're on. All right. Hi, Lauren. How
Okay.
are you?
Hello. I'm good, Ellie. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Nice to meet you,
You
even if
too.
just virtually. I think we just had a bit of a conversation before we recorded, and before we even begin, I said I really like the energy that you have. I'm very big on energy, by the way. So like,
Oh,
I
oh,
feel like
good.
there's a nice kind of yeah.
I think 'cause it's a Friday. This if we're doing this on a Friday, it's like maybe like that's coming into play a bit. So
Brilliant, brilliant. All right. So, for those who don't know you, can you just kind of introduce yourself and what is it you do and your research?
sure. So my name is Lauren Banko. I am a historian. So I'm a social historian, and I work primarily on like the general subdiscipline in history is the history of the Middle East. So I work on the Arab world. More specifically, I work on the history of Palestine pre 1948, so pre Nakba. And I've been working on this since like my graduate days, PhD. I did my PhD at SOAS in London, so the School of Oriental and African Studies. Um, and I worked on the dissertation was on citizenship and nationality for Arabs in Palestine under the British Mandate, and particularly Arab Palestinians who found themselves outside of the space of Palestine, either through travel, work, education, pleasure, and had their mandate granted, so colonial citizenship, either never kind of affirmed or revoked by the British. And then how this sort of formulated concepts of what citizenship and nationality were during this like 1920s to 1948. So that was the topic of the first book from the PhD. But since then, I've been working on two separate projects. So right now, I'm just coming to the end of a Wellcome Trust research fellowship in humanities.
All right.
The topic is, or the title is kind of unwieldy and long, but it's medical deportees. And what that medical deportees, the full title, narrations and pathographies of health at the borders of Great Britain, Egypt, and Palestine from 1919 to 1949. So I'm looking at migrants or people who are crossing the borders within the Middle East to and from Egypt and Palestine, or from the Middle East to Great Britain, and how they narrate their experiences of deportation and entry to those spaces when they are arriving or leaving with physical or psychological health issues and illnesses. And I'm also working on a book manuscript on slightly different. It's called Subverting the Documentary Regime. And it is looking specifically at the space of Palestine. And so my work more recently has been on borders, as you might have
Yeah.
gleaned from this, borders, migration, mobility, deportation in and around the Arab Middle East, so like the Eastern Mediterranean, uh, between the First and Second World War and slightly after that. So the book project looks at the ways men, women, young people crossed into and out of Palestine from the region. So trans-regional migrants and their stories of kind of precarity, marginalization, being told they don't have the right permissions or documentary paperwork to enter and reside in Palestine. And also in this project as well, what happens when they're deported or forcibly removed.
Yeah, it's a lot of things going on.
Yeah,
A lot
yeah,
of
sorry, that
yeah.
is quite a
No, no, that's a good thing actually. And I gleaned over some of the things you do, and I'm like, yeah, wow, there's a lot of things, and some of the things we will dive into detail.
sure.
And probably the first thing that I was that came to my mind, and I probably ask a lot of people who I do this with is like how did you kind of get interested in this area? You know, like how did you come across it? Because it's quite niche. It's a very niche thing what you're looking at. You know the so like what drove your interest? How did you end up here?
Yeah. I mean, I could go with like the big story, which I don't have a good answer for, or like the very like more specific one on these projects. But I think overall, I mean, I studied history at university, and I was able to kind of focus on the Middle East during my master's program and then the PhD. And I always had like an interest from the time I was younger, before I went to university, in the Middle East, in Palestine. This was like soon after Iraq War. So this was like a time period where being interested in the Middle East, where I grew up, I'm from the States. I have no family, like personal heritage connections to the region. But being interested in the region at that time was seen as a bit probably a bit strange because most of the people around me were interested in the region for non-academic reasons and kind of very pervasively negative reasons. But I just really, I loved history once I started doing that as my degree. And I realized, oh, I can actually, kind of make an academic career out of this. So focused on Palestine because I found this, from an activist standpoint, when I was sort of younger, that's what drew me to it. But I just find it incredible, like the wealth of archival work that hasn't been done and that has been done are just really compelling. I could have focused on lots of things, but I feel like finding my niche looking at Palestinian history has been really rewarding. And looking at citizenship, these concepts I'm interested in general, in like a philosophical way, a political way, a social way. A few years ago, around COVID times, I got like a short postdoc, another one at Manchester, since we both share that connection, that was on the principal investigator was looking at refugees globally, histories of refugees. So Professor Peter Gattrell in history at Manchester, he's now emeritus. And I was able to join for a little bit as a co-investigator on this project. And my work was already shifting towards mobility, migration, borders. And this kind of really brought me into like refugee and displacement histories, which is linked, I think, in so many ways to deportation and forced removals, which are topics that, for whatever reason in the history of the Middle East and the Arab world, even 20th century history is fairly not covered in the academic and historiographical literature. So it's something that we don't have a lot of like accounts on until much later, when, the ability to have these voices of people who are deported heard in kind of the post-colonial period. But I look at the period where it's British and French control primarily in the region.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think for me, one of the reasons why I was interested in your work and reaching out to you is probably for a bit of selfish reasons, because I was born after the 1991 Iraq war, the 1990, sorry, so I was born in 91, and at 8 months old, so before I can even recall, we left Iraq, obviously because of the circumstances and whatnot, and then I grew up in Canada and got the citizenship. So like the stuff that you do is all kind of, and then until this day, I always philosophically grapple with these things, identity and citizenship and who am I? I left the region, but my heart is still there and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, so it all kind of ties into the areas that you obviously do on a deeper level. But one of the things that I wanted, and I'm not sure that I wanted to talk to you about is obviously you've been researching Palestine pre-1948 and you've been doing it for a while. As you're obviously aware, since October 7th and the events that happened afterwards, it got a lot of attention, let's just say, and a lot of people who are unaware of it. It became, for a lack of a better word, a bit more mainstream, or more everybody started to know about it. So how has that, the question I'm trying to ask is how has that shift been for you as a historian who's been quietly working on this for too long? Has it changed anything or?
It's definitely made, so I've always been, probably more so even before October 7th, more conscious of the fact that I do find this tricky to grapple with as someone who doesn't have family, personal, yes, but not inherent family connections to Palestine, or to the Arab world, the Middle East, beyond, once I started getting into it, of course, academically and then traveling and research there, and close friends. But, it's made me again sort of in my academic work, when I teach on Palestine, I also teach on this generic kind of the conflict course, but I don't really focus on conflict as the central framework for it. But who gets to speak about Palestine, who gets to talk about experiences, and I think for sure since 7 October it's come out that there are a lot of Western historians or just kind of Western media people. And I've been guilty of this as well, who do have these privileged spaces to write about Palestine historically, to go to conferences, to present our work. And it does make me think should I be the one telling these stories? I have the privilege to have done all of this archival work. But that's made me kind of think a bit more, especially in light of, of course, scholasticizing Gaza and how, I think a year ago there was the statistic, one academic historian left in Gaza. And it's just like everything's been destroyed in terms of, whatever would support a research framework for students, Palestinians in Gaza. So it does make me kind of conscious of, what do I write about that actually would push forward not me or my work, but work that is relevant to understanding Palestinian history and understanding what hasn't been uncovered from Palestinian sort of this historiography and why it hasn't been. So that's maybe one thing I've like grappled with. On a more practical level, of course, I started my current fellowship in 2022, like October 2022, and I did have this like laundry list of research travels to Lebanon and to the West Bank, to Palestine and Jerusalem, which I couldn't do because it was kind of around that time of October in 2023, I would have done it. So much has been digitalized, so that's not a huge problem. But of course, like not being able to travel. I mean, I could, but I think with university travel restrictions, it would be a little bit trickier to do. Now it might be fine, but at the same time, like, should I be doing research at this time period when there's so much else that needs to be like done in terms of like Palestine? So those are a couple of things that I've been like thinking about. I don't know if that's a great answer, but
No, no, that's a good answer. I think it's interesting when you say about it, because as you say, so part of what you're grappling with is obviously you've studied the area, you've done the research, or you're continuously like you've dedicated, and as a result of that, that puts you in a position where you can, as you say, write articles about it. But for you, it's like maybe you don't have the lived experience of. But I don't know. It's not my position to say, but I think you do. I mean, someone who's been doing their homework and their research, I would much rather have somebody like that than, you know what I mean? Someone who's completely reckless, just go on Twitter with nothing and just bash some, you know what I mean? I don't know. That's maybe I have an academic bias, but I always think that somebody who's, done their research and done their academics, and sometimes being a bit far removed from it does give you a bit more of an, objective lens. So I think it's good. One of the things that, and this is this is me going off script, by the way, because it's something that you said you grapple with. You said, how do you balance between what's actually impactful and you know what I mean? So you're doing research on it, and what's just academic. That's also personally for me as a researcher outside this space. But like how do we kind of balance that, or how do we kind of gauge what's important, what's relevant to the cause, and what's mere just academic discourse? It's a very tough question, and it's something I grapple with a lot. But I just wanted to
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not so uncommon, I guess, to grapple with these things. So it's not nice to hear that you do as well. But it is like, it's this shared thing that I think in academia we don't always talk about in any kind of forum, perhaps, like these things that we grapple with that are, deeply affecting of our research. I don't know if there's a good answer to, so what do you do? But yeah.
Yeah, no worries. So we'll probably get on to a bit of what you do. So you look at like from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, or from what I've kind of read about, is like you try to look at like archival documents out there, and from that you kind of try to construct microhistories. So from fragments, right? So my question is like what draws you to this approach, and can you explain it a bit more for like a lay audience or
Yeah. So I think there's always this, like I said a bit ago, now I think it's less so. Perhaps before certain archives were digitalized. This is something else like to grapple with. The best digitalized archive on Palestine pre-48 is, of course, held by the Israeli state archivist. So it's the Israeli state archives. And there's all sorts of problems with using that archive, but it has been hugely beneficial. It kind of has had to be because the actual archival building is since closed, except by appointment. You can't actually go there anymore like you used to be able to for researchers. But everything is digitalized, not everything, but you can request a lot of documents that are not scanned and uploaded to have them scanned and uploaded. And for me, like I primarily have used this for the British Mandate archive. So from 1920 to 1948, and for various political, geostrategic reasons, all of those archives that are British, they're not Israeli, but they were never retransferred from Jerusalem after Israel was created as a state. back to the UK, to the National Archives in London. So there's that. But using that archive, using some other digitalized archives, non-digitalized archives, going back even to my PhD, where I used a lot of Arabic newspapers and press sources, memoirs, things like this, that like you read on like microfilm back then. Now they're also digitalized. I really enjoyed finding these little snippets of stories of people that would come into like the press or like letters to the editor, or in my current projects, criminal case files, court records, like petitions, letters sent to British bureaucrats from Palestinians, from other individuals from outside of Palestine who are there or residing or trying to get there. And kind of like sometimes these are like pleading letters and things. And in my case, what I'm looking at, mobility, people like wanting visas. At the time, like you need a visa to travel by the 20s and 30s. Or people who have been forcibly removed from Palestine, and they're writing like, what is this order of deportation? My home, my business, my family, wife, husband are in Palestine. Like I need to get back. Questions of citizenship were drawn up in my earlier work in newspaper, like letters to the editor by Arab Palestinians who migrated to like South America and tried to go back home and couldn't. So it was like these little snippets of things that were not like a full file. I mean, sometimes there are a full file on some of these individuals, but what drew me to them was that these were letters, or at least documentary fragments from people who were super just normal. They weren't like the elite political figures in Palestine or elsewhere, or wealthy kind of leaders locally, regionally. They were just, some of them are laborers, some of them are orphans, some of them are women who just, were going through a divorce, or just generally like normal people. Some are very precarious or socioeconomically marginalized. But their voices you don't always see as a historian in the archive. And at least until very recently in the history of the Middle East in general, not much has been written on, I mean, the past 20 years this has changed, but like the everyday experience of just individuals and what that tells us about how we can approach or understand like the social history of the region. So that's kind of what I've tried to find a little bit more with the project, and use these little fragments to tell these bigger stories. And sometimes I can trace these fragments through different archives or through different kind of spaces, the same individual, which I find really fascinating. But for the most part, like the stories of people who are deported, for instance, particularly like some of the women, there's a few like fascinating stories of some of them who are either deported because they lose their citizenship after a divorce. So if they're Palestinian, or they marry a Palestinian man, if that man divorces her, she then, in many cases, reverts to being what we would call today stateless, which is wild to think. And sometimes there are children involved, and you don't get like the resolution. Like, did these women actually have to leave? Where on earth did they go?
What happens?
So those, I have to leave them open-ended, but I feel like that's also part of doing microhistory. You can't expect to like follow someone throughout their entire historical journey. And there are all these other like issues that come to mind with these little fragments of stories, because these are also real people. I mean, nowadays, and with my Wellcome Trust project, I got like a subscription to Ancestry DNA, which I haven't really used, but I could theoretically find like some of the children and grandchildren of these people in the archive if I dug really hard. But that's also part of this microhistory methodology and process. Like, what do you do when you have these people's names? You have where they're born. You have like copies of birth registers. Like, this isn't so long ago that these people were really like struggling with the authorities and trying not to be deported. I mean, the modern kind of understanding of deportation as this horrific experience now, I mean, we see this in the United States. It would have been the same in the 1930s. Like, those emotions would have still been just as like raw as we see today. So that's also part of like this, how do you write that into history, and why does it matter? So that's a long-winded answer.
No, no, it's interesting. I think it's interesting. It's also kind of learning for me because obviously I don't do that kind of research, but it's kind of like from my understanding of it, it's well, first of all, like as you said, the beauty of it is you are kind of dealing with your everyday people, like the voices that don't necessarily make it to, the headlines and whatnot. And then, so it's kind of like you're researching and you kind of like an investigation work, you're piecing it all together and you're trying to kind of, like build a thread. But as you said, there are limitations, I guess. You can't like fully know like the full story of what happens next. And it kind of leads on to my one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, it might be tough to narrow it down to one, but like, is there a particular story or a couple of stories that really stayed with you from doing this work?
Yeah, there is one that
Yeah.
the book manuscript that I'm working on, inshallah, it should have been done like 5 years ago. But the way I'm trying to construct it is each chapter is like a stage of the migration and deportation process in Palestine. And I'm looking at like a few stories in each, like separate stories of individuals or their families. And I try and follow them a bit throughout. But there's one chapter, I think I call it Marriage Certificate, or something like this. And I use it to think about like, migration and deportation can tell us a lot about intimacy, marriage, like this sounds kind of like off
No.
topic, but like what happens in like the bedroom in the sense of like migration and deportation are so central to whether a couple in the 1920s and 30s can even have conceive a child, because suddenly there are borders between, let's say, Palestine and Lebanon. And if a man or woman in one place is marrying someone from like just across the border in the other, but that man or woman doesn't have permission to come to Palestine with their new spouse, like what happens? Like, how does a wedding
Mm,
happen when the wedding party can't cross a border? So one of these stories is sort of related to that. It's like a very young Palestinian girl. I mean, she was married quite young, orphaned. I believe her father was killed in the Great Revolt in 1936, the Palestinian Revolt. And a man from, I believe, Lebanon or Syria, he had like a business, so he was kind of middle class, offered to marry her. And she's the one writing letters to the British authorities in Palestine, probably through a scribe. But her younger brother chimes in a bit, like, because her fiance, this man who was much older than her, but was going to marry her, I think he was a friend of her late father, he was being deported because he didn't have the right to be in Palestine. He like traveled across from Syria without permission through the border. He didn't, go through what we would think of today as immigration control. So he was somehow found, maybe he committed like a minor offense. The
yeah.
police in Palestine found he was like what we would say illegally present
Legal.
there. So the young fiance is kind of writing and writing, please let him stay, let him stay. Like, I will protect, I'm Palestinian. He should be able to have my Palestinian like citizenship. And of course, in the 30s, like, and even to this day,
Yeah.
women don't give like their husband's citizenship. It's the other way around. And she's writing, we need to be able to conceive our baby, and we can't do that if he's not here. We need to start a family. So that was one of these stories. I don't know the end of it. I think eventually the man he had to leave. Like, he kept trying to come back, but he had to leave his business and go. The other stories of these two sisters who came from Syria to Palestine in like the 1930s, early 40s. The older sister came first with a Palestinian man, a husband. She had already been divorced. And people wrote, soon after she arrived, I think she settled in the north of Palestine with her then husband. She was suspected of being a prostitute. And her husband was like her pimp. So all of these people in like her little community were writing to the British police saying like, this woman is immoral, she's a prostitute, she's foreign, she's coming from somewhere else, get her out. And this went like all the way up to like, and it went on for years and years. And this woman kept like, and then she brought her sister over, and she was also accused of being a prostitute, her sister. And these two women, again, like they're from a lower socioeconomic class, but their protest against being removed are wild, like so vociferous. The original woman's husband eventually died, and so the woman, like, she really was going to be deported. So she like faked being pregnant. So that those kind of weird stories where she went and got like a gynecological exam and she was walking, I guess the stories from the British side about her, like she's walking in pain, she has back problems, she's heavily pregnant. Like she got the exam and she wasn't pregnant at all. It was just like a ruse. So at the end, she was deported. So those kind of really wild stories that are just also probably so ordinary for the time, like, and completely normal. Like it also in these stories, there's definitely the sense of these borders that are created. They mean very little. And so does the idea of citizenship. I mean, if someone was living in Palestine from like the time they're a teenager or early 20s, established a family, a business there, suddenly are faced with being deported because they don't have a passport, for instance. Like, in their words to the authorities, like, they're not making any distinction between themselves and their neighbors who are born in Palestine to parents who had been settled there for, centuries and centuries. So there's also this very flexible understanding of you can be Palestinian or you can be Syrian or Lebanese just by going there and living there, that like the legal distinctions of it are not, like, that's what doesn't matter to most of these migrants. Even though to the British and the French, that's the only thing that matters. But you can kind of trace, when does that start to make an impression upon people that, you actually need paperwork to show you can live here. You can't just say you're Palestinian because you've been here for 15 years, which I think that maybe has like some modern resonances. So.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think it's funny because when you're telling me these stories, I don't want to make that assumption, obviously, but like I'm tempted to say not much has changed. Here we are today, like in 2000, and I can, from even my personal life and whatnot, recall a lot of similar kind of, you know what I mean, issues that goes on. Like from everything you said, that's what kind of like blew my mind. I was like, we're talking about that time period, and here we are today. Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and say I don't feel much has changed. I know a lot of personal stories of these things happening between borders, and somebody from one part of the Middle East, wants to move with another person, and there's all these kind of things.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Same. I can think of stories as well, like friends, and like very close people in my life that was their family story, and this was like the 1990s.
yeah,
And like, I mean, your story as well is, I mean, the geopolitics are different, but that same kind of like, if you have to leave somewhere, like you do have to think like within the wider Middle East, like the notion of borders and passports, everything, like this is a very real, and of course the issue of Israel, Palestine, like you can't cross certain spaces or fly over certain spaces. So it's also, it's incredibly interesting, like the dynamics that have not changed at all. And
yeah. As I
yeah.
said, it's very interesting and personal to me because, as I said, like my dad is from Iraq, my mom is from Kuwait. Their countries were
Okay.
to
Yes. Yeah.
you
Wow.
can see how that whole kind of and it's interesting because for people who are not from the region, like for them, they think it's all just kind of like, it's all, and I'm like, no, that there is a lot of issues, like just to go from one country to another, because of all these things. And that kind of maps on well to what I was going to talk about, borders and belonging. And you did kind of touch about it. So I know your work is before the 1948 conflict. So like, what did borders look like in that period for those not familiar? Do you know what I mean? Like, how did people move? Who could move across somewhere? So just to kind of, just
Yeah.
talk
So
about that a
before
bit.
48, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For that.
I mean, one thing that I wanted to, and hopefully I'll put this somewhere in the book, and I think in the conclusion, I don't know if you're familiar with, now I'm like looking to see if it's on my bookshelf where I am or if it's in my office in Manchester. I think it's Edward Said's book. It's After the Last Sky. And I think maybe this is the one he had, like, Edward Said, maybe and Mahmoud Darwish, like together wrote this, or one
Yeah.
of them wrote the foreword or the introduction. But Edward Said wrote in this book, I think it's Darwish's book, but Edward Said wrote about his mother. And he was recounting that his mother used to tell him, I think his mother maybe was not originally from Lebanon, but she came from Lebanon to marry his father. And in the story that he writes about, Edward Said, from what his mother said, when she arrived between Lebanon and Palestine, like shortly after his parents were married, they arrived to the British side of the Palestine frontier. And the British immigration officer, to let them into Palestine, ripped up Edward Said's mother's passport, her Lebanese passport. And I made a comment, now you're here only on your husband's passport. So you're both included on this, which was true. Spouses were on the same passport. And Edward Said had written, he'd always wondered, did that mean that his mother, because she was not recorded as a singular person entering Palestine, Edward Said asked, does that mean there's one more space for a European Jew to come in? Which was not how immigration control, that wasn't really the logic. But that's one of these ways of thinking about the border at the time that I feel was probably reflective of how certain Palestinians thought, letting in Europeans, but not letting in other Arabs. And so the way that borders kind of looked so essentially after the Ottoman Empire falls, the League of Nations establishes that the British and French have these trusteeships or mandates over Syria and Lebanon for the French, and then Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan for the British. The French and the British themselves come together in London and elsewhere, and they draw the borders. And for a long time, they are largely gravel roads. The rivers are, today in many cases, form the boundary between Palestine and other places. But the borders are largely not just Palestine, but if we're looking Syria into Iraq as well, Palestine, Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria. I mean, they're not hard and fast borders like they would be now. But increasingly through the 30s, they do become like that. And there are only certain places individuals can legally cross. I mean, today, some of them are the same places in Palestine, between Jordan and Palestine. Bridge crossings. Between Lebanon and Palestine, there's a tunnel crossing. But I think there's under 20, during this time period before 48, legal crossing points into and out of Palestine. Some are only for people. Some are only for livestock. Some are only for people bringing things to a market, but not travelers for pleasure or anything like that. So for the most part, the borders are open and people can cross, across a river, or if it's low. So it's pretty unpatrolled until the late 1930s. Because in various parts of the Arab world, the British and French are concerned with anti-colonial, anti-Zionist uprisings. So they, make barbed wire fences and actually kind of rigid boundaries that Israel then, of course, intensifies after 1948 to a level that, Palestinians cannot come back, of course, refugees. But borders were kind of more like what we would think of as boundaries or frontiers for a very long time.
Yeah. So probably is much more kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, loose, or it's more kind of than it is kind of today. And one of the things that, because obviously the work you do is you're looking at it from a historical lens, and you try to do it from as you said, with academic rigor. When you when you do your research on historical Palestine, for the people that engage with your work, do they try to? This is just a question. Do they try to map on or read current politics into it? Because now it's becoming very hard to kind of dissociate anything you do without somebody kind of finding a way to read politics into it, or being this person is doing this, and that, or is subtly trying to say X, Y, and Z. If that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm lucky that in a lot of academic circles where I present the research in that way, it's to people who aren't reading too much, but
they're in that space.
People still are. Yeah. Occasionally, and I think other historians who work on similar themes of migration, maybe not in the Middle East, but elsewhere. You do get emails from family members generations later who have somehow found your work. Because some of us, and I've done this in one article where I definitely got like her mother was the centerpiece of the article. And the daughter was very thoughtful and engaging with the work. She wasn't upset in any way. But that was one of those times that made me think, oh, should we be publishing full names of people? But I have friends and colleagues who have done this in other contexts, and they get emails also wanting to know more about their family history. So I think perhaps until very recently, that's been maybe the people who engage with our work from a non-academic sense are very interested in their own family's trajectory, which I think is completely valid. I mean, I would be too if someone was writing about like my, grandparents' village in Slovakia or something like this. So I think there's that. But then, of course, there are, this is maybe to go slightly off topic, but like one of my students actually brought this up in a class I teach. Like day one, he was very engaged. But this question of, so why do other Arab states not let Palestinian refugees have citizenship or stay long term?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question.
Yeah, of course, it's a very good question.
It gets brought up a lot. Yeah.
Yes, and it's so complex in many ways. But my work, in some ways, it leans into this argument that even Trump was saying a year ago. Let's just send Palestinians from Gaza to Egypt and Jordan because they're Arab, they can go anywhere. Which, like, in a borderless or newly bordered Middle East before 48, that was the way everyone thought. We can just settle anywhere. So I also, have to think in a way carefully, I don't want that kind of work to be politically seen as, this validates the fact that Palestinians, do they need a right of return, for instance? Do refugees anywhere need to, ever leave their host countries and go back to where they're from? And we see this with Syrians today since the end of the civil war. States in Europe, I'm not sure the US now because it's just so a mess about everything, but are saying, okay, Syrians no longer need to claim asylum or have refugee status because they can go back. So I think that also is part of when work like mine looks at migration and displacement, that's one of those political talking points that could be drawn from it. Hopefully it's not that often, but I think that's one of those risks, especially with the context of Palestine, for sure.
Yeah, I can see how that can kind of happen if somebody reads into it. I know what you mean, because you're kind of looking at it from a way of just explaining how things were before and how going from place to place was, for a lack of a better word, was a bit less, I don't know, regulated or there were less restrictions. That's maybe the better word to say.
Yeah.
But somebody can kind of look into that and say, then why don't they do that now? But it's very complex. It's not the same situation now as opposed to where it was before. So that does make sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we're also from an academic standpoint, you are probably dealing with people who look at it from an academic standpoint. But one of the things that probably is worth mentioning then, because you study obviously displacement and refugees in historical Palestine. So what patterns do you see that feel relevant to how we think about refugees and borders today? Because it's just it's a very, very, it's not just a Palestine thing, you know what I mean? Obviously, it's a very important issue there, but especially now more than ever, this has been such a big topic. So yeah, what's kind of your thoughts on that and what kind of can we glean from?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And I don't know if I have a ready answer, but I should because it's so important.
No, it's okay. It's part of it.
Yeah. I think, there's the Palestinian case. It's unique in its own ways that, Palestinian refugees have their own set of obstacles that one state has placed in front of them rather than nowadays. Maybe this is, kind of these relevances where Palestine was not put into or the reason for the initial refugee conventions that the United Nations signed on to and created in 1950 and beyond, or before that and then beyond. And so I feel like one of these questions that maybe can be raised, certainly in colonial era Middle East or imperial Middle East, it was the colonial and settler colonial states that decided who is a refugee, who is displaced, who can go where. This notion of claiming asylum was not really, this comes much later, post-Second World War. But then there's this interim period where the UN is supposed to, in many ways, if states sign on to refugee conventions, asylum conventions, the UN is supposed to be this international body that regulates what states can do for refugees or not do. And of course, now we've slipped into probably a very predictable scenario where states that never signed on or remove themselves from UN conventions can define displacement, who can get asylum, who is stateless, who has to be given citizenship in any way they want to. And of course, the example of the United States is so also complex, but under Trump, people are being deported when they have green cards, legally able to stay somewhere and have not committed a crime, in the sense that a crime that would force them to leave. So there's that I think that's super relevant and very, very colonial and post-colonial. There is no international regulation that benefits asylum seekers and refugees globally. Nothing that can be guaranteed for someone who is stateless, to have a forum to go to and force a state to do anything for them. So I feel like in the era of globalization of the 20th century that everyone was so keen on, that's done very little for people who can't cross a border without fear or without a passport, or to flee for their lives, or being forced back places that they should have never went in the first place. So I think that's one of those relevances that's not just unique to the Middle East. But within the Middle East, of course, there are their own kind of set of historical circumstances whereby many states never signed on to international refugee conventions, or the region has created its own, but which don't give the same level of sanctuary and refuge for certain displaced persons that the international conventions would have. So of course there's also that. I could probably go on and on about kind of the injustices, but I think those things are kind of, I don't want to say the relevance of these histories. We should see what happens when colonial powers categorize people in particular ways. And I think that's one of the things that my Welcome Trust project looks at with people who have physical illnesses or psychological distress or illnesses. They're categorized as undesirable humans. And also this term of illegal, really comes into fashion to denote a human in the 30s, globally, but in the Middle East. And I think those categories we still, not us, but some states still use as the bedrock of who can be a desirable citizen, who do we want, these very nativist policies that again aren't just in the global north and North America. There are also these very rigid policies within the Middle East. Of course, the colonial powers didn't change in many cases the fact that only, men can give citizenship to the wife, and the children are the citizenship of the man or the father. And what happens when that citizenship is contested? The mother can't do anything. So there are also those kind of, and it's not just in the Middle East that's like that, but those long-standing ways of giving citizenship, passing that on, that were quite colonial, but have remained to this day and affect how people can travel or not travel, or seek asylum or not seek asylum.
Yeah, I'm just kind of taken in. I think it's very interesting because, as you said, from my point of view, I see this rhetoric a lot, and it's coming, this whole issue of asylum and these people shouldn't be here and whatnot is making a comeback, and it's stronger than ever. At least from how it's making a lot of noise. Let's just say.
Yeah.
Now, I don't like to see the world as black and white, as these people are evil and then they just blah blah. I try to understand, what is the point they're coming from? Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think they should also understand the other side of the story, which I think there's a huge lack of it because. And I've actually even spoken to people who have that rhetoric, these people, these undesirable, quote unquote, and they're coming here and they're doing all of that. But I always tell them, you have to understand kind of the context. And as you said, this is something that's present. For example, my mother is Kuwaiti, but we don't get Kuwaiti citizenship. We don't get the privileges. So then what happens when for example, if we didn't move abroad and we stayed there? So there's a lot of nuances that kind of urges you to kind of leave and go, for example, to a Western country. And it's not, it's the way it is. Do you know what I mean? Where do you go?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the rhetoric is, I mean, we do have to try and understand it. And I should say, I mean, the UK is, I don't know whose playbook is being used anymore. But I mean, and also in parts of Europe, that's like a whole other kind of issue in certain European states that are very similar to the using the same rhetoric. But I, I mean, I feel like the interconnectedness of the world that was emphasized, like before you and I were probably both born or very young, of like globalization has really led maybe to some of this rhetoric, because like the economic aspect of in the UK, perhaps more so than the US, economically, like we can't support all of these migrants, we can't like take in anyone else. So I think that, I mean, that also plays a role, because you've people who are very well qualified who also, like the UK immigration system is, it's not fit for like the world as it is now and the way that people move for education and jobs. So these systems, of course, affect asylum seekers, immigrants, people who are seeking to find refuge. But the economic component, I think, is there too, and sharpens that rhetoric. And in, the earlier period, this was very, I mean, settler colonialism is kind of built on some of the same rhetoric as well. So I think that also comes to play too, in thinking like, nowadays, like what is the way forward, to think of like people have to leave at places, but who can organize this system, or who should organize the system of migration? I mean, the whole notion of like a bordered world is also very modern, like, less than 100 years old. I mean, maybe slightly more than that, but we've only had borders, passports, immigration controls for a very, very short time. Of course, the time before that is like colonialism and imperialism, so which is worse? But it's also like this question of what is the notion, like what does a border actually, what should it do if we have to have them?
Yeah, yeah, it's it's one of the more, as you said, tougher questions, and what is the way forward, and that's
Yeah,
something probably we won't be able to
yeah,
unpack, you and I, but it's just food for thought. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is you talked about medical deportees, very specific focus, very niche area. So how did you even kind of discover that was a thing, and just kind of, yeah, like what's the research you've been going on about, and
yeah,
just try to like explain it to a lay audience, like, yeah,
yeah.
like that, because it's
I
quite
think
niche.
it is quite niche. So one of the things I think that came up from the manuscript that I've been working on for 1,000 years, that this was before the medical deportees, the Welcome Project, but I think I came across a couple of different archives, in which it was very like clear that there was someone. I think in one case it was a man, in another case it was a woman, who were trying to claim to come back to mandate Palestine from somewhere else. I think one from the region, one from South America, somewhere. And they had, the woman for sure was suffering from what might have been schizophrenia. Probably it wasn't, probably she was just a normal woman, but this is like 1930s categorizations of women's emotions. And so because she was suffering from that condition, her doctors, wherever she was, refused to endorse her like letter, like her kind of pleas to return to Palestine. The
Mhm.
doctors kind of mediated with the immigration authorities. And I found that very interesting, and sort of delved into it a bit more. And in some cases, increasingly through the 1930s, the British in Palestine, if they accepted someone into government hospitals, that person often had their citizenship checked. So whether they were a naturalized, I don't really look a lot at European Zionist Jews in my work, but many of these naturalized Europeans who migrated to Palestine, or settlers who migrated, usually checked out because they had naturalization papers. But many Arabs did not have any, even if they were Palestinian, like they didn't have papers to prove
Paper,
it.
yeah.
Um, and so like it was the doctors and nurses in certain hospitals, including psychiatric hospitals, would have to actually check up with the immigration authorities. And I found that link like very interesting, because it meant certain people like would be kicked out of their treatment or not allowed back to Palestine, even if they were from there originally. And so it became part of elsewhere too, across the Middle East for sure, across everywhere. We still have these things. Public health laws meshed with immigration laws. So people with certain contagious diseases, infectious diseases, or people who were seen as not fit mentally or physically, health-wise, are barred from immigrating somewhere. So, of course, this was, in the 1920s, 30s in the United States, like this was hard and fast, these rules. And Canada, I believe, as well. So that's what kind of got me into it, like thinking, so people are deported because they medically are undesirable. And I'm interested then, like the lens of microhistory, how did these individuals then try to press upon officials, doctors, public health officials, immigration control, border regime authorities, that they were mentally and physically fit, or that their conditions were like going to be exacerbated by being removed. So I try and look at it through that lens. And there's I'm not sure if you know her. I think maybe she's a clinical lecturer at Manchester, Dr. Louise Tomko, who works in medicine, but also like medical anthropology. And she came up with this term biocredibility, which is very social sciencey, so biocredibility, but this way that she kind of conceptualized modern refugee populations who were seeking to enter. I think maybe she worked on the UK. And they kind of used this discourse or strategically presented themselves as refugees or asylum seekers as credible witnesses to their own like medical suffering. So as experts to their own mental and physical health, as a way to kind of show like the border authorities, yes, like I have these conditions, but I'm still like I'm credible to talk about it. Like these conditions are caused by the experience of displacement. So kind of using them to build their asylum cases. And I try and put that in the historical context, like to also see that individual migrants, like they know a lot about their medical conditions and they can use this very strategically to avoid deportation. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in with the medical aspect of the project.
Yeah. It's interesting. And when you mention it, it's quite high stakes. You know what I mean? Like when you
Yeah,
put it that way. Yeah.
that's a
I
really good
never
way to
thought of
put
it
it.
that
Yeah.
way. Yeah. It's more high stakes than you think because that can dictate whether you get back in the country
Yeah.
or whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so just a bit from a maybe a technical point of view is like how do you decide which stories to tell, for example? Because I can imagine, you can only reconstruct part of those lives. You know what I mean? So like,
Yeah.
how do you decide which ones to tell or which ones make it in the research or the book or whatever piece of
Yeah,
work?
it's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to use, as a like I'm trying to use like a spectrum of stories, I guess. And the Medical Deportees Project, I'm looking at, like I think I've tried to do too much because there's also this fascinating story of Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, from what is now Yemen, who came to the UK as sailors in the early 20th century. And many of them were also kind of targeted by these public health regulations. So I'm trying to look at individuals who were kind of not from like the elite classes traveling because they have like the privilege to, and they just happen to also be ill. But people who are kind of the drivers of industrialization in the Middle East in many cases. In Palestine and Egypt, there's this kind of circulation of migrant labor from what is now Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but also Jordan, Transjordan at the time, Syria, who are working on infrastructure projects, for instance. So they're key to like the history of the region and building and industry. But many of them are then targeted for being like too ill or contagious to enter somewhere or to stay. So I'm interested in like those stories because it forms those and other stories. I try to use the ones that are also tied to like wider global experiences, I think. And like labor migration is one of those like kind of the way the global fits with these very like local microhistories in many ways.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's kind of, yeah, one of the methods,
Something
or
that
one of
kind of
like the methods.
ties into, because it's kind of interconnected, the wider issues as well. The
Yeah,
stories was
yeah.
kind of okay. That
Yeah, absolutely. And also like these wider stories of like, how do regulations that prevent people with like typhus or like schizophrenia from entering a space, like, do these stories actually like tell us something about how these policies work elsewhere, like the medical aspects of these policies? So I'm trying to also kind of like use that as a filter.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of like a whole web of
Yeah, yeah. It's too big of a story. Like, I mean, I wish I could do this for the next 10 years. I mean, maybe not, but like I could definitely keep going on and on. But you're right. I mean, I do have to like pick and choose what micro narratives are the most like central to understanding these frameworks of how public health and immigration worked.
no, that is great. As you said, by the way, like if we can dive into this, you can go on for hours, but like I am conscious of time. So there are questions I want to ask about meaning and purpose. That's kind of one of the themes I was hoping to get out of this
Sure.
podcast. Is kind of when I bring people on is, so like obviously you do this work for a long time. Like how do you approach telling different or complex histories in a way that resonates outside of academia? This is something I'm always very big on, like how do we do work that resonates outside of
Resonates.
academia?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the hardest, honestly. And especially, I mean, it's hard in general. I think it's hard in the UK because we are also expected to keep that in mind. Maybe not like the meaning and purpose aspect, maybe a bit too much in the like forced aspect. How do you kind of
Ver-
connect with the
Yeah.
public, like engagement? I mean, I feel like for the Welcome Trust project, there are these relevances, of course, to modern day systems of immigration control and asylum and how we talk about mental health among migrants and refugees. And so I think that's one of these, like the meaning and purpose, and like this is one way of communicating to outside of academia. I did with a colleague in Manchester and a colleague in Liverpool. We had a year and a half ago now, I think, a little workshop in Manchester around the theme of this notion of biocredibility and the medico-legal border, which is not a term I made up, but someone else did, but I use it heavily, like the way we see the border as both an intermeshing of, medical controls and legal, like documentary border controls. And this conference workshop brought together a number of people who are practicing like in medicine or clinicians who work on like mental health with refugees, for instance, um, or in hospitals rather than their own clinical practice. It brought some people who work on asylum seeking and a couple of young former asylum seekers who spoke to the participants, as well as historians, sociologists. So that kind of like dialogue, I think, between what I was very intimidated by, and probably intimidated by you as well, because like in this whole other field of medicine and pharmacology, and it's fascinating to me, and I didn't think there would be links. But this workshop, I mean, we came to like, how do we actually talk about this border? How do we talk about one person who participated? She works with refugees who are very traumatized. Like, post-traumatic stress disorder is not the most relevant term to use for like refugees from the Middle East, for instance. This is a very westernized concept. So this little workshop also made me and probably others reassess like even the terms we use in academia and medicine to refer to populations who come to the UK or to the global north with physical or mental or other kind of medical issues. Like, the terms that we use are not necessarily fit for their experiences. So how do we like engage with their experiences or the history of their experiences into our work, either as historians, but also as practicing in, the
Mm.
colleagues who practice in medicine? So that's maybe one of these things. And of course, like the issue of Palestine always, like, how can this work do anything for, maybe not so much for like Palestinian liberation, but certainly for the notion of like, these stories, like I said at the beginning, like are of real humans, like men and women and children who really struggled with the colonial authorities, with the settler colonial, like Zionist movements who were pushing them out. I mean, I didn't maybe mention this, but the edifice of immigration control in Palestine, of course, under the British, is overwhelmingly to support Zionist Jewish immigration. It has nothing to do with supporting Arab migration or caring about Palestinians having a citizenship paper. So I think like these histories also hopefully kind of give the sense of like, of course there were Palestinians in these places, but they also had like very clear understandings of who they were. And they often understood their friends and neighbors who were from like Syria or Lebanon as just as Palestinian, like just maybe not as Palestinian, but they had as much of a right to like live with them, work with them as they did as indigenous Arabs. So it also like brings maybe that into the kind of modern sense as well. Like Palestine was a place that was hugely like multicultural, in part because of the British allowing Europeans to come in, but also as like this nexus of the Arab world for many, many ways, and very like accepting of course, like migration from the borderless neighboring territories. But I think we don't always remember that in thinking of histories before borders.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, or at least for me, like someone who's maybe like I don't research in the area, but kind of what you said, there is something around when you tell these stories, because it's easy for someone who's not in that space to just get caught up in the, you know what I mean, to just get caught up in that, for example, the what's going on, in the news and whatnot, and then it just becomes kind of like a political thing, it's this versus that, and it's this agenda versus that. But I guess I'd like to think all like at the end of the day, all of us like we are human at the end of the day. So like when you kind of put that element of stories and people see the history and that these are people that live there and they're going through like issues. It's not
Yeah,
just,
yeah. And not to like romanticize it, but just to be like, this is like the ordinary ways that people interacted with like state authorities, colonial authorities, settler colonial authorities. I mean, for what it's like, at least those interactions, like we can see they happen. Like there was not just a passive, and no one, maybe some people who are not as informed or not from the region, like no one thinks like this was just passively accepted, the things that have happened. But it kind of reiterates that like ordinary people were very like knowledgeable about their own mobilities and their own ways to confront being forcibly removed by like colonial powers. So I think that, like I said, for what it's worth, maybe like adds something to like the lived experiences historically are not just like, kind of things we should gloss over and see as historical actors really didn't contribute anything to modern notions of what legal identity would look like.
And I am conscious of time, so I'm just going to probably wrap
Sure.
it up soon.
Yeah.
But what's the most uplifting or hopeful thing that you've encountered in your work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think like, I hate to kind of like not, I don't hate to not talk about my work, but I feel like the past couple of years, at least in teaching, this is not necessarily my research, like there has been such a shift in the interest in Palestine, the interest in what the state of Israel has been doing. I feel like students are, and maybe this is maybe to not center my work, but students have really been so thoughtful, reflective, critical in ways that before a couple of years ago, surely that was there. But students are, I think now, they're able to use a particular language without fear to describe how they feel about events in Gaza, but also events like what is Palestine, like what does this mean globally? And I think that has been, again, aside from my research, something that I'm sure like those of us who work on the region or even like encounter teaching on the region have not really seen in the UK or in the US in the same way. Like this absence of fear and self-censorship, which I think I was certainly guilty of this in the past, because you are worried. But of course, like what has happened has made very clear, like we need to not self-censor on issues to do with Palestine if we work on that. Like why get into this field and do research and teach on like the region if we don't also, we can't also involve ourselves in trying to push like the need for very, very critical reassessment of how states are interacting with Israel, for instance, or just like kind of uncover histories and voices that, we don't need to use only, this sounds like maybe a bit too much, but like sources that are objective or written by people who really are kind of not involved in the region. So that's kind of one thing. or the main thing that's sort of apart from my research. But also just the fact of like doing this research on these little stories of people, like the emails, like I mentioned, that I have gotten, have been just really rewarding to see like someone say, oh, this is like the experience that I didn't realize. I didn't know my grandparents had like a passport scanned that's now in an archive that I can look at and see like place of birth, their weight, their height, their eye color, a photo of them. So I think that's also really, really rewarding. And I think anyone, like I said earlier, working on migration history who finds these like things in the archive and then uses them or is able to ask permission to use them is a really rewarding thing for people who want to understand that migration trajectory that they themselves probably didn't go through, but that their family went through, and that's led them to where they're settled today in many cases. So
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. And for me personally, that's the part that I really I'm happy about and why we're having these discussions. And like I like the idea that people are now more comfortable talking about it, whereas before it was kind of like, you know, that really gives me
yeah,
hope. You know, the fact people
yeah,
can are now asking the questions and are comfortable talking about it,
yes,
even from a critical standpoint. Now, you don't even necessarily need to be like in supportive of the cause, but just to kind of
yeah,
have that
yeah,
conversation and being like, yeah, it's okay, let's understand.
yeah, yeah.
And then the other part, as you said, was also a learning for me just by having this kind of talk. I was like, okay, like there are things you can do with the archives which I wouldn't have thought about. That is actually a thing. You know,
Yeah,
when
but your
someone is not,
story as well, like your family's like, it's like, I find these things so fascinating just for what they're worth, even like the hardships, but it's just like, I just find migration stories really, really fascinating. So even
that's,
if you're not like in the academic world of
it is,
working on this, it's so interconnected.
it's absolutely brilliant. And one last thing. So for the
Sure.
listeners who aren't historians, for somebody, for example, if they, what's one idea that you would want them to think about more or take away from all the work that you've done? So if someone was to just skip this podcast, like what's one thing you want them to take from all of this?
Oh, oh gosh, putting me on the spot. Perhaps one thing to take away from all of this. Phew. I
Not
feel
an
like, I
easy
mean,
question.
yeah, maybe this is also too academic-y, but I think there is a way to see like colonial state powers, like there is a production of knowledge that happens that is not always at the level of like the state or authority figures, like looking at people who are traveling in mobile or who are deported, even to this day, like their experiences like form this nexus of knowledge of how do you deal with these processes. And I feel like that is important to understand and consider. And when I read other work on like migration, like there's wonderful work on like migration between Latin America and the US, for instance, in the modern sense. And the way like those stories are just, they're super compelling. They tell us about like human need, but also what happens when human need like juts against border controls. And I feel like to understand anything about like why people have to be mobile or leave or are forced to leave, it maybe shouldn't be like the official narrative that we read. It should be the narrative of the people who are in the trajectory of mobility rather than like, you know, what others are saying about them. Sometimes what others say about them and what migrants say about themselves, I've found are the exact same thing, for better or for worse. But I think if we like see the knowledge that's produced in migration circulations, that I think tells us something about how, you know, how we might understand migration, borders, like interconnectedness, rhetoric as well. It kind of leads into like these bigger conversations.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that. I mean, as someone, I always say that I think from someone who've had that conversations with people, I think I would like to think they got a bit more out of it from when they talk to someone with that experience. It makes them think a bit differently because, as
Yeah.
you said, like when somebody narrates it and there's more of a human feel to it. But anyways, like for those who are listening, we know that Lauren has to be somewhere, which is why I've kind of had to rush it to the end. But first of all, thank you so much. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you. But for those who would probably want to learn more about your work and what you do, where can they find you? Is there anything in particular you recommend?
So I do. I now can't think of like my website URL, but I do have like a profile page on the Manchester University website. So I'll be at Manchester for a bit more. I do have the first book that I wrote came out with Edinburgh University Press in 2016. This is a bit older now, but I do have an article recently in the Journal of Refugee Studies that is like a microhistory of one of these migrant laborers between Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. This is from 2023. I forget the title of it. It's like something Syed's Encampment, but it's the Journal of Refugee Studies. So there is that. And I do also have a chapter coming out in like a global microhistories of the Middle East book, but that'll be probably later next year. But hopefully with the book project, I can update like when and where that might be in press. So, and I've also just published a co-authored book with Oxford University Press. It's titled Refugee Voices in Modern History, with my colleagues Peter Gattrell, Katia Nowak, and Anadita Ghosh, and that came out of the Refugee Voices in History project at Manchester. So that came out just a few months ago.
Definitely. That's brilliant. So I'm probably going to ask for a lot of links to put when I publish this so people can know where to look for. But once again, thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank
really
you, Ali. Yeah, it's been wonderful talking. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.